Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It's Rabbi Akiva Males, and I hope that you're well. Today is Wednesday. It is January 6th, and we're getting ready for Parshas Shemos. I want to start by asking you for your indulgence if we could dedicate the Torah learning today as a merit for a refuah shalema, for a healing for my mother. My mother, as you may have heard, she's recovering from COVID, and she needed some assistance. Thank God my father's recovering. He's doing well. He's at home. My mother needed the help of physicians, so she's in the hospital in Cleveland now. She's getting the care that she needs, and we're closely being in touch with everyone there, and hopefully in the coming days she'll be able to be back home recovering in her own home where I know she would like to be. But in the meantime, she should have a refuah shalema together with all the Cholei Yisrael, with everybody else who requires healing. And just to dedicate the Torah learning today, and my mother's zechus, her name is Fega Bela Ba'Shem Leah. She should have a refuah shalema b'so shar Cholei Yisrael. So let's jump into something in Parshas Shemos. There's obviously so much to talk about in Parshas Shemos, but there's something particular that I wanted to share with you today. I find it really fascinating. So let's see, excuse me, right at the beginning of Shemos, the Parsha begins by telling us, Ve'ela Shemos b'nei Yisrael. These are the names of all of the children of Israel, Aboy Mitzrayim, who came down to Egypt, Es Yaakov Ishu Beiso Bo. And they all came down with Yaakov, everyone and their households, they all came down. Now Rashi right away jumps on this. That was Pasuk Aleph in Parak Aleph of Sefer Shemos. Rashi right away jumps on this because Rashi points out, Ve'ela Shemos b'nei Yisrael, Afal pi Shemonan b'chayein b'shmosan, we just counted them when they were still alive. At the end of Sefer Bereshis in Vayichi, we counted everybody. And when they came down to Mitzrayim, we counted everybody. Why do we feel the need? Why does the Torah feel the need to count everyone again? So still it says, Chazar umanan achar misasan. Still we count Bnei Yisrael again after the original Shvatim had passed away. Lo dia chibasan. This is a way of God demonstrating for us how much He loves them, how precious they are to Him. By counting, you constantly count things that you care about. I remember teaching this once to a bunch of kids in 5th grade. And I told them, I said, look, do you have something you collect? Baseball cards, stickers, whatever it may be. You take them out to show them to your friend. Before you put them away, since it's your valued collection, you just count it again just to make sure everything's there, that you're not missing anything. And that's what's going on here, is that Rashi's pointing out the reason why Bnei Yisrael are counted again at the beginning of Sefer Shemos, even though they were just counted at the end of Sefer Bereshis, is to demonstrate the love that Hashem had for them. Let's go a little further to Pasuk Hey, just 4 psukim later. So Pasuk Hey says, Vayi kol nefesh yotzei yerech Yaakov shivim nefesh. There were 70, the descendants who emerged from Yaakov were 70. Yosef haya b'Mitzrayim. And by the way, Yosef, that includes Yosef, who was already in Egypt. So let's see the Das Zakenim there. The Das Zakenim is from the Balei Tosfos, and he points out a beautiful idea. He says, Vayi kol nefesh. Why does the Pasuk now say that, by the way, the grand number was 70. The big tally was 70 when they all came down to Egypt. Why do you got to tell that to me again? So the Das Zakenim says as follows, L'kach manan achshav. That's why they're counted again now. And again, not just the number 70, but again, the reason why God counts them, everyone again now. First reason we said was Rashi's, to show His love. But the Das Zakenim is proposing another reason why Hashem counts everyone now at the beginning of the servitude in Egypt. L'kach manan achshav. That's also why they're counted again now. And even though they were counted while they were still alive, and then the Sefer Bereshis, since the Torah is about to tell us that they increased in great numbers and they became strong, the Torah wants us to know that even though they started off with such a small number, they just started off with 70 people, Atzmu v'rabu, they became strong and they multiplied so many ad sheish meos elef ragli, until they were 600,000 adult males who left Egypt. By the time of Yetzias Mitzrayim, there were 600,000 adult males. Once you factor in the women and children, you're talking about, they say, between 2 and 3 million people. So the reason why at the beginning of the story of Shibud Mitzrayim, of the servitude in Egypt, it counts everyone again, is to make us aware of this astonishing feat, how much Hashem loves Bnei Yisrael, but also how he caused us to increase in numbers. Incredible population explosion. Even though we started just with 70, nonetheless, when it came time to leave at the Geula, at the redemption of Egypt, we left with 600,000 adult males. And again, factoring in all the women and the children, you get to between 2 and 3 million people. And that is absolutely astonishing. So that's why the Torah repeats those numbers at the beginning of Sefer Shemos. That's the Das Canaan. Now, if you just want to see proof, how do we know where did they pull that number 600,000? The Torah tells us about that. Look a little bit later. That's in Perek Yud Beis in chapter 12. I got on the bottom of page 1. So the Parsha tells us, the pasuk tells us, "Vayisu b'nei Yisrael meRamses Sukosa," that b'nei Yisrael, when they were leaving Egypt, they left Ramses and they go towards Sukkos. Kishesh meos elef raglei agvarim, and they were about, not an exact number, but they were about 600,000 on foot. Hagvarim levad mitaf, and that's just the adult men, besides the young children, besides the women. So again, this number 600,000, that's something that the Torah tells us. And then the next pasuk, Lamed Ches 38, the pasuk says, in addition to those 600,000, Vigam, and also Erev Rav Olaytam, there was a great mixed multitude. People who were living in Egypt who decided they wanted to cast their lot with the Jewish people, foreigners and probably some Egyptians too. There was this big mixed bag of people. Olaytam, they also went out with them. Vitsonu, Vakar, Mikna Kavemo. They went out with flock and cattle, many belongings. Okay, now that was what we're going to do. That's how we know when they left there were 600,000. Now, just to get back into our Parsha Shemos, Perek Aleph. Now we just saw Pasuk Aleph and Pasuk Hey. Now we're going to see Pasuk Zayin, verse 7. The Pasuk says, "Bnei Yisrael paru v'yishritzu v'yirbu v'yatzmu b'mod mod." There was the population explosion. The children of Israel were fruitful. They swarmed. They increased. They became very strong. And the land became absolutely filled with them. So the pasuk, the verse tells us about this population explosion. How do we explain this? How did they increase in numbers so radically, so greatly? So I think all of us were taught in school, or at some point we encountered this Rashi that we're about to see here. Vayishritzu, that they swarmed. So Rashi quotes the Medrash. What does it mean that they swarmed? Show you Yoldos Shisha Bekeres Echad. They bore 6 children at each birth, meaning each womb bore 6 children. Makes it sound like Jewish women were regularly having sextuplets, and they were having 6 kids at a time. And that would explain for this massive population explosion which occurs, and how we go from the number 70 to 600,000 just adult males. I know I was taught that in school. That's the quickest way to explain this, and perhaps many of you were taught that, or many of you had chanced on this Rashi in your own learning. What I want to share with you this morning is this question about Bnei Yisrael. How did they experience such a population explosion, which was so drastic? This is something which has bothered great thinkers. We're going to see many of our Mefarshim, but also non-Jewish thinkers. You're going to be surprised who some of them are, as well as modern-day thinkers and scholars, Talmidei Chachamim as well, looking for approaches as to how can we explain this. This seems to be very challenging to explain this population explosion going from 70 to 600,000. And remember, 600,000 is just the adult males. So we're really talking about 2 to 3 million. So it's really astounding. And some of the great thinkers, both in Bnei Yisrael and the world at large, have been bothered by this. And I want to share some of this with you. I think some of this is going to surprise you. So the first one I want to share with you is perhaps one of the earliest notices that there were some minds that were bothered by this and were giving Jewish scholars a hard time. The Ibn Ezra, as we have him in your regular Chumash, the Mikros Gedolos, we have one of his commentaries, but he had a second commentary as well. And you'll find that in some other editions. I know there's a Toras Chaim version of the Mikros Gedolos that Mosad Rav Kook put out, and they have 2 versions of the Ibn Ezra in there. One of them is called HaKatzer, the shorter version. That's the one I'm sharing with you now. That's not the one that's in your standard Mikros Gedolos Chumash. So in the Ibn Ezra's, in his commentary called the Katzer, the shorter version, again, this does not appear in our standard Chumash, but it's in the Toras Chaim version that Mosad Rav Kook put out in Israel. I saw an astounding comment. Look what he writes here. He's going in Parshas Beshalach. Beshalach tells us, right at the beginning of Beshalach, it tells us that Bnei Yisrael left chamushim. Chamushim, the root of the word chamushim is chamesh, 5. So what does chamushim mean? So Rashi brings down a couple of explanations. One explanation Rashi brings down is they were armed, that they had weapons, and that'll explain how in the fight with Amalek, where did they have weapons from to put an army together to fight Amalek when they were attacked? But Rashi brings down another idea, and this comes from Mechilta, one of the early midrashim, that it says chamushim means they were only 1/5. In other words, the population that left Mitzrayim was a fraction of the numbers of Jews who lived in Egypt. And many of them died in the plague of darkness. That's a Medrash Mechilta that's quoted in Rashi. And he says 1/5 went out. The Mechilta goes out to say, some say it wasn't even just 1/5, it was 1/50th, which would mean the numbers are astounding. And then it even says there's an opinion of 1 out of 500, which is just totally off the charts. And I think in previous years, I shared with you a beautiful idea from Rav Shimon Schwab, how to understand that Mechilta, that it shouldn't be taken at face value. But that's not for today. What I want to do, though, is share with you something that Ibn Ezra says. The Ibn Ezra, he's going on that pasuk about chamushim, that they left and they were armed. And he says, he quotes this Mechilta, that it might mean they were 1/5, that there were many more Jews who died, which would mean the numbers of Jews are astounding. We have a hard enough time explaining how do you get from 70 to 600,000. Now imagine getting from 70 to 600,000, which is just 1/5, or a fifth, the numbers would be crazy. So look what Ibn Ezra says here. He says, I'm not getting into this. I'm not going that way. I'm not going to explain this like what the Medrash says, that chamushim meant 1/5. I'm sticking that it meant they went out armed. And he says, why? What's his motivation? V'dai lanu hatzar. We have enough headache. We have enough trouble. Shanachnu bo im chachme Yishmael. We have enough trouble debating this and getting tsaras from the Muslim scholars. There are Muslim scholars who are studying Chumash, and they are giving us heartache. They're giving us such a headache about how do we make sense out of this population growth. Shehem Omrim, they're telling us, and how is it possible? That out of 55 men, again, I don't know why he has 55 instead of 70. Maybe, again, the number 70 that we have is including the women. So 55 is just the men. I didn't look up where he got that from. Sheyodu Masayim, the Eser Shanim, that in just 210 years, how many people could they produce? Sheish Meos Elav Zecharim mi Ben Esrim. 600,000 adult men from 20 and up. Now, once you factor in the women and children, you're talking about 2 to 3 million. He says, I'm having a hard enough time, and all the Chachmei Yisrael are having a hard enough time trying to deal with the Muslims who are hacking us at China, making us crazy about how do you explain 70 to 600,000. Once you factor in women and children, it's far greater than 600,000. So I'm having a hard enough time just keeping on a shot level of explaining how do we get from 70 to 600,000 to the Muslims who are making us crazy. Don't even start with that medrash that chamushim might mean 1/5 or 1/50th or 1/500th. We're never going to be able to deal with them if you start that. So what that just indicates to me is that Ibn Ezra is giving us a window into what was going on in his lifetime. In his lifetime, it wasn't just that our Mefarshim were struggling to how do you explain the population explosion. He's saying Bible scholars, non-Jewish Bible scholars, were trying, they were wrestling with this, and they were making many Jewish scholars crazy, trying to come up with an answer. So that's what he's telling us, that this was an issue that plagued thinkers in the Jewish world, but in the non-Jewish world as well. I'm going to share with you a piece of history that I don't know if you were aware of. This was from 1960. The title, I found this on the JTA archives. Ben-Gurion claims only 600 Israelites had left Egypt in the Exodus. This was May 18th of 1960. And here's how it's reported, again, from the article. Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion was embroiled in a hot new controversy today with Orthodox religious elements over a new version of the biblical story of the Exodus, which he expounded at a press conference. Mr. Ben-Gurion said that only 600,000 Israelites had left Egypt in the Exodus. I'm sorry, 600, not 600,000. That only 600 Israelites had left Egypt in the Exodus, and that the Israelites had lived in Egypt for only 2 generations. According to the traditional version, the Israelites had remained in Egypt for 400 years. That's not precise. It's really 210. 400 starts from the time of when Yitzchak was born, or the Bris Bein Absarim, from when Yitzchak was born, around that time. and 600,000 of them had participated in Exodus. That's also not true. It's 600,000 adult males. The number of total Jews who participated was far greater. The newspaper Hamodia was around back then, organ of the ultra-Orthodox Agudat Yisrael, denounced Mr. Ben-Gurion's views as heresies and refused to publish them. It called him a violator of the most sacred of Jewish values, the Bible. Dr. Jacob Unterman, chief rabbi of Tel Aviv. Rav Unterman was a huge Talmud Chacham. He was the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv, and then later the Ashkenazic chief rabbi in Israel, also sharply attacked Mr. Ben-Gurion for his views. The article goes on. If you hear noise in the background, there are leaf blowers right outside my window. I'm sorry about that. I can't schedule these things. So here's this article that David Ben-Gurion creates a whole mess in Israel because apparently he was giving some kind of press conference and he made the claim saying, I can't wrap my head around this. I can't explain this, how a population growth could have been so great that there could have been 600,000 Jews. And again, that's just adult males who came out of 70 in such a short amount of time. So he gave a press conference and we're about to see this almost collapsed the Knesset. The Knesset was so mad at Ben-Gurion's public statement here, the government almost fell apart. So that was May 18th, that story. Here's a day later, May 19th, JTA. Knesset rejects Aguda non-confidence motion against Ben-Gurion. Here we go. The Knesset, Israel's parliament today, rejected by a vote of 61-6 a motion of non-confidence by the ultra-Orthodox Agudas Yisrael party in an attempt to rebuke Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion for his challenge last week to the traditional biblical version of the Exodus story. Premier Ben-Gurion had claimed that only 600 Israelites left Egypt in the Exodus instead of 600,000 mentioned in the Bible. He also suggested the Israelites were in Egypt for only 2 generations rather than the 400 years indicated in the traditional version. The 6 Aguda deputies were the only members voting in favor of the motion. Members of the National Religious Party, which participates in the governing coalition, voted against the motion on the grounds that the Knesset was not a suitable forum for a discussion of the issue. They say we're here to run the country, not to rebuke Ben-Gurion for his views on Tanakh. In setting forth this version of the Exodus story last week, Mr. Ben-Gurion stressed that his views were personal ones. In replying to that good motion in the Knesset, today in the Knesset, the premier categorically rejected any suggestion that his opinions were anti-biblical. His views on the Bible, which was sharply attacked by the religious press and in sermons over the weekend, also included the opinion that it was Jews who chose God and not God who chose the Jews. Oh boy. Despite their vote against the non-confidence motion today, leaders of the National Religious Party, as well as Hatzofeh, the official organ of the party, bitterly criticized the premier over his expressed views, challenging the biblical statements. Rabbi Yisrael Meir Levin of Aguda, who introduced the motion, begged the prime minister to retract, describing Mr. Ben-Gurion's theory as absurd and a Chilul Hashem desecration of the name. The prime minister, replying, reiterated that his views were those of an individual and said that he was just as proud of the Jewish past as was Rabbi Levin. He added the motion was not a subject for debate in the Knesset, which cannot reconstruct the history of over 3,000 years. He urged Rabbi Levin to respect other views as he expected others to respect his. The prime minister did, however, express regret that Kol Yisrael, that's the radio station, had redundantly rebroadcast his theory as he gave it to the press. The right-wing Cherut and general Zionists abstained in the vote. That should be the note. It should be in the vote. So that's from the article there. So Leila's pointing out, you can't blame the press. You can't say something, a public figure like this, say something which is going to have big implications, then blame the press for reporting on it. That's bound to happen. Ezu chacham aros anolad. The Avos tells us that, Pirkei Avos tells us that a smart person is someone who sees the result of their actions. He should have seen this one coming. But be that as it may, I found this fascinating. Here's something Ibn Ezra tells us that scholars in the ancient non-Jewish world were troubled by. And now you fast forward about, I'm going to say that's going to be about 600, if not 500, 600 years from the time of the Ibn Ezra to the time of Ben-Gurion. And here's Ben-Gurion raising the issue again and creating a whole brouhaha in Israel, which almost collapses the Knesset. And this is, truth be told, this has been something that people have been dealing with for a very long time. I saw another source that's amazing, and I want to share this with you. There was an excellent book that came out several years ago. Rabbi Yisrael Meir Lau, who was the former chief rabbi of Israel, served with distinction. and in the last number of years had been serving as the chief rabbi in Tel Aviv. I don't know if he is still serving now or if he retired, but he still plays a very prominent role in Israeli life. His son, Rav David Lau, is the current chief Ashkenazic rabbi in Israel. Rav Lau was a young Holocaust survivor, and he went through as a little kid. It's amazing how he stayed alive. He was a little kid who was hidden in Buchenwald and stayed alive. And a couple of years ago, he published an autobiography. It was first came out in Hebrew and then it was translated into English, called Out of the Depths: The Story of a Child of Buchenwald Who Returned Home at Last. Incredible book. It was out of print for a while. Now it is back in print. If you haven't read it, I strongly urge you to read it. For a while, Layla and I were buying this as a bar and bat mitzvah gift for kids. It's just such a powerful, powerful story. And if you have not read it, I strongly suggest you could get it on Amazon and Jewish bookstores. Excellent book. In the middle of that book, there is a couple of pages which are just out of this world bizarre. And let me explain what I mean by this. Aside from serving as Israel's chief rabbi, Ashkenazic rabbi, he writes about many of the incredible incidents that happened during his tenure in that position. But he also writes about how, in a certain sense, he played a role of almost an ambassador of sorts for Israel, because he traveled widely around the world. He's very eloquent, a great speaker. And he found himself in many venues representing Israel. And he's got several pages in there where it's strange, where he's writing about spending some time in Cuba, how he visited Cuba at the height of Castro's power, and conversations, getting summoned to Castro's palace, and late at night, very bizarre hour of the night, and having this lengthy conversation with Castro, which I would just say it's bizarre. Just the conversation, how he's painting the picture of what's going on in Castro's mind, in his world, the time of the day it is, and in his worldview. It just really, it's eye-opening as to just how cut off from the world Fidel Castro was. But it's just astonishing. So in the middle of this conversation, I found this, and it just struck me as I could not believe this. So let's jump right in. After we had exhausted the topic, he was talking about something else, Castro asked my permission to pose another question that had disturbed him for some time. He jumped thousands of years back in time. The Bible says that 600,000 Jews left Egypt. And I know that elsewhere it says that only 70 Jews went down to Egypt from Canaan. How is it possible that in 400 years, again, it's really 210, but that's his literal reading of it, 70 people turned into 600,000? And the number is really greater, because 600,000 is just adult males. Factor in the women and children, it's 2 to 3 million. Could such a thing really happen? Castro wondered. I was surprised at such a question, which had bothered him, he said, for some time. So how does Rav Lau want to answer? He quickly wants to answer what we were told in school, that Rashi that we had up above. And he says as follows. He says, in chapter 1 of the book of Exodus, I explained, the Bible says, and the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly and multiplied and waxed exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. Our sages explained that at that time, Jewish mothers regularly gave birth to sextuplets, meaning 6 kids at a time. That's what Rashi said. Shisha bekeres echad, that it was 6 from one womb, 6 at a time. So he says, that's what I told Castro. That's the quickest way to finish this. Something miraculous happened. You're right. There is no logical explanation of how did 70 get to 600,000, which really, again, factor in the women and children, 2 to 3 million. So there's no logical way to explain this. So how do we explain it? Something miraculous happened. Women were having sextuplets. So he tries that on Castro. Let's see how it goes. Castro was incredulous. 6 babies in one womb, he asked, waving his hand dismissively, as if he could not believe such a phenomenon. In other words, as a rationalist, you can't pull out the miraculous. So he says, can there be such a thing, sextuplets, he asked? At this point in our conversation, I felt open towards him and permitted myself to relate that my son was the father of triplets. If triplets were possible today, why should we assume that sextuplets were impossible in ancient times? I added that in Israel, a mother had given birth to quintuplets a few years ago. Let's go to the next page 5. Castro was amazed. I think it was the first time he had ever heard of triplets, not to mention quintuplets. Again, modern medicine just doesn't exist in Cuba, and he's so cut off from the world. And he insisted on pursuing the topic. You have triplets in your family? He asked with a childlike thrill. My wife, who in the meantime had arrived in response to his late invitation. Again, this was at a really bizarre time of the night, early morning hours. Pulled from her purse, again, this is before iPhones, pulled from her purse a picture of our triplet grandchildren, right? Nowadays, you just would open your phone and show the pictures. This was a proud Bobby, and in her purse, she probably had one of those folding accordion plastic things of pictures, and she's got a picture of the triplets, grandchildren, and handed it to him. Charmed by the photo, Castro stared at it for a long moment. As he held it, he stroked it between his fingers, murmuring, "It's a miracle. 3 in 1 womb, and they're so beautiful, each one. Interesting. They're not identical." It's like the first time in his life the guy's ever heard of triplets or seen it. Wild. After returning the photo to my wife, he again focused on the biblical arithmetic problem. He took out a pad of paper and began to make lists and calculations in an attempt to prove the biblical account. From the 70 Jews who went down to Egypt, he made 35 couples. He multiplied these by 6 descendants each, then multiplied several more times. In a few minutes, he gave me a disappointed look and announced that the calculation did not work out. Frustrated, he explained his logic and said he had done me a favor and calculated one generation as 20 years instead of the usual 30. If 35 individuals married at age 20 and began having children, then 400 years equaled 20 generations. Multiply each generation by 6 and the result did not equal 600,000. Patiently and carefully, I asked him to try again. But he only became more confused with the numbers. Then I asked why he didn't use a calculator. Castro stared at me angrily. "A calculator? That thing you punch with your fingers? I belong to the generation that thinks with the head, not with the fingers. At any rate, Grand Rabbino, Grand Rabbi, the calculation doesn't work out." I felt uncomfortable as I witnessed his efforts and the seriousness that he invested in deciphering this numerical puzzle. I offered him a broad hint. To solve the problem, I suggested, I'd suggest you check another verse in the same book of Bible. And a mixed multitude also went up with them. Castro gave a sigh of relief, as if I lifted a burden of many years from his shoulders. So you see what Rav Lau did. Rav Lau played a trick on him. I think he was totally disingenuous. What he did was he saw, I'm not getting anywhere with Castro, getting him to explain 600,000. So what did he say? The next pasuk, it says, V'gam eruv rav Allah imahem. A mixed multitude went up with them. And he said, maybe that's where the 600,000. It's not from the 70 that turned into 600,000. The mixed multitude, once you factor them in, now you got 600. But that doesn't get us to our problem. This is a way out of the problem, I should say, of how did 70 turn into 600. This is a whole different chevra who joined up with them. But I think, and I would bet you, Rabbi Lau was being disingenuous because the pasuk says, V'gam, after saying there were 600,000. Let's go back. I'll show you the pasuk. I'm going back. I believe it was on page, I believe it was on page 2. Look on page, bottom of page 1. It says there, it's in Shmos Yud Beis. Vayisu b'nei Yisrael meramsei Sukosa, kishe shmeos elef ragle agvarim avamitav. B'nei Yisrael went from Ramses to Sukkos, and in B'nei Yisrael there was 600,000 adult men. Next pasuk, V'gam, in addition to the Jews, Erev Rav Allah Itam, a mixed multitude went up with them. So I do not think, in all honesty, Rabbi Lau believes that that's a solid answer to Fidel Castro's question. He's trying to get him off his back. And there's the same way the Muslim scholars are hassling Nevin Ezra. Here's Yisrael Meir Lau in Cuba, and he's being hassled by Fidel Castro, who's making him crazy. So he says, okay, how am I going to get him off my back? I'll tell him this thing. I got an answer to just get him to stop bothering me. I'll tell him this thing about the mixed multitude, the Erev Rav. That's how you get 600,000. But I do not believe in any way that Rabbi Lau was being genuine with him there. He was just really being disingenuous to try to get him off his case. That's what I think. By the way, look at the last sentence of that paragraph. What was Castro's next question? He gets into all Megillah with. Then how do you know that the Jews of Ethiopia are really Jews? So now he starts another topic. Tell me, I don't know, that should have been a new paragraph. I don't know why he threw that in there. But now Castro starts with Rav Lau saying, now I want to understand, the Ethiopian Jews. How do you guys, what makes you so certain that they're Jews? That becomes a whole new Megillah that he gets into with them. But anyhow, read this book. Fascinating book. But the part that just jumped out of my mind was this section. But again, what I want to get out of this is that thinking minds going back to the time of Yetzias Mitzrayim, were struggling with this. And in our days, there are many people, not just Castro, there are many people who struggle with this, and many good Jews are struggling with this. Because if you want to be a rational person, in other words, again, the easiest way out of this is say what Rashi said in the Medrash, Shisha B'keres Echad, that they were having sextuplets, and that's how you get to 600,000. But if you don't want to be a miraculous-minded person, if someone is locked into being a rationalist, it's very hard to explain how does 70 become 600,000, which really is 2 to 3 million. So how do you explain that? That's very, very hard. And there are many good Jews, observant Jews, who are struggling with this. So I want to share with you, the next thing I want to share with you is a beautiful approach I found that'll work for the rationalist, whether you're Castro, whether you're Muslim, whether you're a good observant Jew who's just who's saying, that's fine, that's great that Rashi approach exists, but can you throw me a lifeline for the rationalist in me that might explain this without having to resort to saying something miraculous happened? So that's the last source I want to share with you. By the way, I just got to tell you, we'll come back to this in a second. I just have to make a footnote. One thing that made such a massive impression on me is during this trip to Cuba, Rabbi Lau documents something which just made such a strong impression on me. He writes in the book that during the trip to Cuba, he took a trip into the Jewish cemetery. He says whenever he goes to visit any locale, he makes a point of going to see the Jewish cemetery. You can learn a lot about Jews and their community by visiting a Jewish cemetery. And he saw in the Jewish cemetery something that just totally blew his mind. In the Jewish cemetery, he sees a grave, and it says it's a Jewish grave, and there was an epitaph that's written on the grave. I forgot the exact wording, but it was basically of a Jewish soldier, a Jewish Cuban soldier, who was honored to go and fight against capitalism in the war that was being fought in Korea, and he gave his life for the sake of communism. And here lies a kadosh, like someone who's sanctified. And Rav Lau was just blown away seeing things turned on its head like that. That here was a communist country that had buried a Jewish communist soldier, someone who had died fighting in the Korean War on the side of the North Koreans against the UN forces, against America and the other UN forces that were there. And here he was buried, and he was saying, that he proudly went off to fight, and he gave his life for the great cause of communism, and he was like a kaddish for that. And it was just like astonishing, saying about how sad it is to someone to have like just bet on the wrong horse and just to be on the wrong side of history. Just what a powerful, powerful thing. But he says that in there. Anyhow, but getting back to our story. So we're leaving Castro, we're leaving Cuba behind now, and we're going to Gush Etzion. We're going to Eretz Yisrael now, and we're going to Gush Etzion, which is right outside of Efrat, and we're going to actually Yeshivat Har Etzion, which is there, and we're going to learn something from Rabbi Yaakov Meidan. Rabbi Yaakov Meidan is one of the Rashi Yeshiva, is one of the heads of the Yeshivat Har Etzion, which is in Gush Etzion, south of Jerusalem, right outside Efrat, and he's known to be a real baki, a real expert in Tanakh, and he gives a lot of shiurim in the Yeshiva Tanakh and Gemara, and then Jewish thought. I found a beautiful approach that Rav Meidan has that is totally consistent with our Jewish sources and the Rashi, but at the same token can really appeal to someone who's a rationalist. That you can use that Rashi, you can say that Shisha B'keres Achad, that they had 6 in one womb, but it doesn't have to mean the miraculous explanation that we thought it might have. So I want to share this with you because this could really be a lifeline. Again, not just for the Muslim scholars or for Castro, but even Jews, observant Jews you might know who might be struggling with this. So let's read it. This is in part of a longer article of his. So this is just an excerpt. So it's part E that says 6 at one time. We have not yet arrived at a satisfactory explanation of the unreasonable rate of reproduction, turning 70 souls who came down to Egypt into 600,000 adult males. You see, he's got it correct. The 600,000 number is adult males, not including the women and children. So there it gets to 2 to 3 million, meaning millions altogether at the time of the Exodus. If this natural reproduction took place over the course of only 3 generations, we must assume that every woman bore several hundred children, which is astonishing. So he says, let us return to Ephraim and the other tribes. If we assume based on the genealogy in Yehoshua that a generation was 21 years, So Castro said that too. He was going to make generations just 20 years. So Rav Meidan says he's got a proof from Sefer Yoshua. Now you could say that in Tanakh, a generation is 21 years. During the course of 190 years, such that the last generation would be in their 20s at the time of Exodus, right? We said they were in servitude in Egypt for 210 years. So he says if 190 years goes by, which would account that last generation is in their 20s at the time of Exodus, there would have been about 9 generations, which is as the genealogy describes. And say for Yeshua, this will make sense. So in Jewish tradition, there was about 9 generations that thrived in Egypt from the time that they came down to the time of Exodus. Now, if each generation is about 21 years, he says, accordingly, we may explain Chazal's teaching that the women used to bear 6 at one time, literally 6 from one belly or 6 from one womb. This does not mean that the women used to bear sextets, that they had 6 at a time. That would be an altogether unnatural phenomenon. What the teaching means is that every mother, or belly, you might say, would bear 6 children during the course of her life. In other words, I'm saying the average woman without modern medicine, you might say in Israel, what do you mean? There's women who are having 10, 11, 12 kids in their life. Yeah, but that's with the addition of modern medicine. Before there was modern medicine and kids were dying in infancy and women dying in childbirth, it was not all that common for women to be having 10 kids. So he says you can read this Rashi, that it doesn't mean they had sextuplets. They were having 6 at a time. It meant that women were healthy women. Your average woman was having 6 children in the course of her childbearing years. We may assume that on average, these 6 children would be 3 sons and 3 daughters. And this accords with the size of the families noted in our parsha, keeping in mind only the sons are listed. Let us now attempt to calculate the numbers of Bnei Yisrael. Based on the assumption that the generation that went down to Egypt numbered 60 males who were still of childbearing age. The next generation would have been 180 males. The third generation, 540. The fourth generation, 1620. The fifth generation, 4860. The sixth generation, 14,580. The seventh generation, 43,760. The eighth generation, 131,280. And the ninth would have been some 400,000. Again, this is just males. Assuming that it was the 7th, 8th, and 9th generations who left Egypt after about 190 years there, were 600,000. And after 210 years, all were aged 20 and above. So that's what he's saying. He's saying that, what does it mean? How do you get that there was 600,000 males? It means that you factor in, at the time of the Exodus, you had people from the 7th, 8th, and 9th generations who were men, who were all from 20 and above. That could get you to 600,000. And again, once you factor in the women and children, you have 2 to 3 million. So he says the key is to say that that average Jewish woman was having 6 children, and those children were having also 6 children, 3 boys, just to say roughly 3 boys and 3 girls. And that's how you can end up with these numbers. And he says, and if it was 3 generations worth who left, generation 7, 8, and 9, and he says the numbers now they could add up. And you don't have to resort to say that sextuplets were happening all over the place. It says the miracle of the reproductive multiplicity in Egypt was therefore a hidden miracle. In other words, it still was miraculous, but now it's toned down a lot. That despite the hardships of Egyptian subjugation and their persecution, women still bore 6 children. And this average did not waver up until the time of Exodus. May God fulfill for us his promise in the Torah, be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a community of nations shall emerge from you, and kings will emerge from your loins. And that's, I thought, a beautiful approach. So what I really like about this is as follows, is that we've got a couple, and I think this is true whenever we learn Torah. We have to look for multiple lifelines because you're never going to find one approach that works for everyone. And that's the beauty of having different Mefarshim. Some Mefarshim are going to be more rational, some may be more mystical, some may be more miraculous. And you'll find different people have different interests, different leanings, and different approaches will appeal to different people. And that's why it's so healthy to always know that there's a multiplicity of options that are out there. So you can find the one that'll work for different people. So I think what we've done this morning is we've shown that something incredible happened. Shivim Nefesh, 70 souls go down to Mitzrayim, and at the time of the Exodus, time of Yetzias Mitzrayim, there's 600,000 adult males from 20 and up. Once you factor in the women and kids, you're talking about 2 to 3 million people. That's astounding. How do we account for those numbers? So we saw Ibn Ezra tell us that the Muslim scholars of his times drove him crazy about this. We saw also that there's a way Rashi tells us how to just solve this. Is that what we were taught in school? Is that Shahayu Yoldos Shisha B'Keres Echad? Is that women were having 6 at a time? And a simple reading of that means at a time. 6 out of one womb means 6 at a time, which means sextuplets. So if women are having 6 at a time, they're multiplying like rabbits. And therefore, it's just these litters of kids coming out. And therefore, that's how you get to 600,000. But that's really miraculous. And that's beyond the laws of nature. That's not something any of us are used to. And that's why this approach, when Rav Lau tried this on Fidel Castro, it didn't work on him because it's asking him to take a leap of faith. And it's not just old Fidel that's going to have a hard time with that. There are many good Jewish, observant Jews who would have a hard time with that. So it's important to know that there are non-mystical, rational approaches that are out there that do not ask someone to take such a great leap of faith. And they could still arrive at being at peace with the Chumash, being at peace with the Chumash's account. And this approach from Rav Meidan in Gush Etzion does just that. And you only wish at the time of Ben Gurion, when Ben Gurion created this whole brouhaha, in what year did we say that was? 1960. We just wish that someone had already uncovered or someone had already unearthed this approach that Rav Meidan made popular. Perhaps this could have, he could have shared this with Prime Minister Ben Gurion. Maybe this could have put his mind at ease, and maybe this could have prevented this whole brouhaha that took place in May of 1960, which, as we saw here, created a whole tumult. And and I don't want to say came close because the resolution didn't come close, but some parties in the Knesset were voting to dissolve the Knesset over this. So I found this absolutely fascinating. Hopefully this is an approach you can share with anybody that you might know who could be bothered by this account. And if it can help put their minds at ease, it would certainly be a great service. I'm gonna stop the recording now.